In March 2011, a group of teenagers in the dusty, quiet town of Daraa grabbed some spray paint. They had no idea what was coming. They wrote a simple anti-government slogan on a local school wall, deeply inspired by the Arab Spring protests that were sweeping across the entire Middle East. They thought it was just a minor rebellious prank, a bit of teenage frustration, but they were tragically wrong about the regime's reaction. This single, seemingly small act of defiance was the tiny pebble that started a massive, unstoppable avalanche of violence and geopolitical maneuvering. It ultimately created the most complex, destructive, and confusing geopolitical black hole of the entire 21st century, drawing in players from all over the globe. At the time, Syria was firmly ruled by President Bashar al-Assad. His family and political party had maintained a tight, authoritarian grip on the country for decades. Instead of simply ignoring the graffiti or giving the kids a warning, the local security forces arrested and severely tortured the young boys in secret facilities. When outraged parents, relatives, and neighbors took to the streets in peaceful protests to demand the immediate release of their children, the government decided to make a terrifying example of them. They responded to the peaceful crowds not with dialogue, but with live ammunition and tanks. What initially started as peaceful, local demands for basic democratic reforms and human rights rapidly transformed into something much darker and more violent. The brutal military crackdown didn't silence the people, it ignited nationwide furious protests. Entire cities began to openly defy the central government's authority. By summer, military defectors and armed civilians banded together to form the Free Syrian Army, or FSA. They now had one singular goal: overthrow the government. At this exact point, almost everyone involved thought this would be a quick revolution. The regime arrogantly thought they could crush the uprising in mere weeks. Meanwhile, the rebels optimistically thought the regime would simply collapse in a few months. Just like in Egypt or Tunisia, they were both completely wrong. They all failed to account for one crucial rule of modern warfare: when a nation falls into total chaos, global superpowers start treating it like a giant strategic chessboard. As 2012 approached, the illusion of a quick victory completely vanished into thin air. The battlefield was hardening. The Syrian army, despite possessing heavy Soviet tanks and absolute air superiority, found itself dangerously bogged down in brutal urban combat. Neighborhoods in ancient, historic cities like Homs and Aleppo were systematically reduced to geometric piles of rubble and dust. The rebels, intimately fighting in their own familiar streets, effectively used guerrilla tactics to hold off the government's heavy armor. But the rebel movement faced a massive, fatal problem: they were completely decentralized and deeply fractured from within. There was no single, unified, Free Syrian Army. Instead, it was a chaotic network of hundreds of separate local militias. Each group answered to different commanders, followed different political ideologies, and fought for wildly different local goals. Some factions fiercely demanded a secular democracy, while others envisioned a strict, unyielding Islamic state for the nation's future. The Syrian government strategically capitalized on this division, intensifying their assault on the fractured and uncoordinated opposition forces. They deployed heavy artillery and crude, indiscriminate barrel bombs from helicopters, turning entire vibrant residential blocks into grey dust. The human toll skyrocketed immediately. Millions of innocent civilians packed whatever small belongings they could carry and fled in terror. This massive exodus set the tragic stage for the largest, most severe refugee crisis of our modern era, as the government rapidly lost control of the northern and eastern borders. A dangerous power vacuum was officially created. And in the ruthless world of geopolitics, nature absolutely abhors a vacuum. The local civil war was now officially dead. In its tragic place, a massive, multinational proxy war was being born. The global players were finally ready to move. By early 2013, the Syrian government was losing ground incredibly fast. It looked like Assad's regime might actually collapse entirely. Enter Iran. For the Iranian government, Syria was their most vital Arab ally and the absolute crucial land bridge to supply Hezbollah in Lebanon. Losing this vital geopolitical connection to the Mediterranean was completely unacceptable to Tehran. They had to intervene immediately to save their most important strategic partner. So, they literally opened the national checkbook. Iran began sending billions of dollars in credit lines and absolute oceans of oil to keep the regime afloat. But money simply wasn't enough. They quietly dispatched elite military advisors and strategists from the Quds force to completely reorganize the crumbling Syrian army. They didn't stop there. Iran mobilized thousands of highly trained, battle-hardened Hezbollah fighters from neighboring Lebanon to fight directly on the front lines. Almost overnight, the battlefield dynamic completely shifted. The exhausted rebels weren't just fighting the Syrian army anymore, they were facing a well-funded, highly organized multinational coalition. But the rebels weren't fighting alone either. Wealthy Gulf states, like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, saw a golden opportunity to bleed their regional rival, Iran. They quickly began funneling massive, unprecedented amounts of cash and heavy military-grade weapons to various rebel groups deeply entrenched across the shattered country. Meanwhile, Turkey, sharing a massive and porous northern border with Syria, opened its gates, allowing endless supplies and new fighters to flow directly into rebel hands. And then, the United States stepped into the shadows. The CIA launched a massive covert program, reportedly spending nearly $1 billion every single year. Their specific goal was to quietly train and arm vetted rebel factions with advanced anti-tank missiles, specifically designed to destroy the regime's heavy Russian armor. If you are struggling to keep track of exactly who is funding who, you are not alone. The proxy network had become an absolute geopolitical nightmare. Every single time one side gained a tactical advantage, a foreign sponsor would simply pump in more weapons and cash to perfectly balance the bloody scale. The illusion of a quick war was completely dead. In its place stood a brutal, heavily funded global stalemate, designed to keep the other side bleeding. The brutal proxy stalemate reached a truly horrifying and tragic climax in August 2013. The whole world suddenly woke up to shocking footage. The target was Ghouta, a densely populated suburb of Damascus. A devastating chemical weapons attack using deadly sarin gas had struck the sleeping neighborhoods. The results were catastrophic. Over 1,000 innocent people, including hundreds of children, lost their lives in a matter of terrifying, suffocating minutes. The international community was completely paralyzed by the sheer horror of the event. It crossed every single boundary of modern humanitarian warfare. Just a year earlier, US President Barack Obama had sternly declared that the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime would cross a clear line. He drew a metaphorical, red line, heavily implying that such an atrocity would immediately trigger direct United States military intervention and devastating airstrikes. As the horrific news from Ghouta spread, the entire world held its collective breath, fully expecting American cruise missiles to rain down on Damascus. But the anticipated missiles never came, fearing getting dragged into another endless, exhausting Middle Eastern quagmire like Iraq. The United States fundamentally hesitated. Instead of launching a military strike, a last-minute diplomatic deal brokered by Russia was struck to supposedly remove and destroy Syria's chemical weapons stockpile. While it avoided immediate international war, this hesitation sent a loud, crystal-clear message to the dictator and all the players on the ground. The message was unmistakable. The West was absolutely not going to directly intervene to overthrow the Assad regime, no matter what weapons were used. This crushing realization fractured the already divided rebel movement even further. Deeply frustrated, demoralized, and feeling completely abandoned, many fighters lost all hope. They began abandoning the moderate Free Syrian Army in droves, choosing instead to join much better funded, highly organized, and far more extreme Islamist factions. The chaotic geopolitical board game was about to get a terrifying new player, one that didn't care about anyone's established rules or red lines. This new faction would soon aggressively sweep across the desert and begin painting the entire map black, plunging the region into a completely new nightmare. While the entire world was completely distracted by the proxy war stalemate, a terrifying new monster was quietly growing in the eastern deserts. An extremist splinter group, heavily radicalized in the chaotic aftermath of the Iraq War next door, perfectly exploited the massive power vacuum in Syria. They called themselves the Islamic State, or ISIS, and they absolutely didn't just want to topple the Assad regime like the other rebels. In 2014, ISIS swept across eastern Syria and northern Iraq in a horrifying blitzkrieg, actively erasing modern borders to establish a global caliphate. They were brutally efficient, incredibly wealthy from capturing local oil fields, and heavily armed with captured American weapons left behind in neighboring Iraq. Suddenly, the entire geopolitical calculus flipped completely upside down. The game had fundamentally changed overnight, and everyone had to adjust. For the United States and its Western allies, overthrowing the Syrian government was no longer the top priority. Stopping ISIS was now number one. A massive US-led global coalition quickly formed. They took to the skies and began heavily pounding ISIS targets with relentless precision airstrikes. But airstrikes alone don't win wars. On the ground, the United States desperately needed a reliable, highly effective local partner to do the heavy fighting. They finally found one in the Kurdish militias operating in northern Syria. They were quickly rebranded and heavily armed as the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. Heavily backed by absolute American airpower, advanced intelligence, and special forces equipment, the SDF became the incredibly effective tip of the spear against ISIS. This new alliance seemed like a perfect, clean solution, but remember, this is Syria, where every single solution immediately creates a massive new problem. This US-Kurdish partnership absolutely infuriated neighboring Turkey, a crucial NATO member and a major, historically vital American ally in the region. The problem was, Turkey viewed these specific Kurdish fighters not as heroic allies fighting terrorists, but as dangerous terrorists themselves, linked to insurgencies inside Turkey. So now, the United States was heavily arming a rebel group that its own NATO ally was actively bombing. The web of alliances had officially reached peak absurdity. By late 2015, despite massive amounts of Iranian financial and military help, President Assad's forces were completely exhausted and rapidly losing territory once again. The Syrian regime was just months, maybe even mere weeks, away from total, irreversible collapse. Their military resources were stretched to the absolute breaking point. But just as the opposition prepared for a final, decisive victory, the biggest geopolitical game-changer of the entire decade suddenly arrived from the freezing north. September 2015, Vladimir Putin officially ordered the heavy Russian military to intervene directly in the Syrian conflict. The bear had officially entered the sandbox. Why? Well, Russia had maintained a vital naval facility in the Syrian coastal city of Tartus for decades. It was their only military foothold in the Mediterranean Sea. For the Kremlin, losing Assad meant permanently losing this priceless strategic asset to Western-backed rebel forces. And that was simply not an option they would ever accept. Under the public guise of joining the global coalition to fight ISIS terrorism, highly advanced Russian fighter jets suddenly filled the Syrian skies. But there was a massive catch. They weren't primarily bombing ISIS targets in the eastern deserts as they loudly claimed on international television. Instead, they directed their massive, devastating firepower directly at the very same moderate rebel groups that were heavily backed by the CIA and the Gulf states. The Russian intervention was an absolute masterclass in brute force geopolitics. They completely ignored international outcry, diplomatic norms, and the rules of the proxy game. Using overwhelming air support, highly advanced missile defense systems, and secretive mercenary groups, Russia aggressively turned the tide of the war almost overnight. Major cities that the rebels had fiercely held for years, like the eastern half of Aleppo, were subjected to brutal, medieval-style military sieges. They endured relentless, systematic bombing campaigns that slowly pulverized entire neighborhoods into dust, until the starved, exhausted defenders were finally forced to surrender. The once realistic dream of a rebel military victory, or a democratic transition, was now completely shattered into a million unfixable pieces. The so-called quick war had now dragged into its bloody fifth year. And the dictator everyone thought would fall had just been firmly saved by a superpower. As the regime, heavily backed by Russia and Iran, slowly recaptured the populated heartland of Syria, the nature of the conflict morphed yet again. It was no longer a massive nationwide rebellion to topple a central dictator. Instead, it became a series of tense, highly localized border security operations. Let's look at the north. Turkey, absolutely terrified of the US-backed Kurdish forces permanently controlling its entire southern border, finally made its move. They launched multiple direct military incursions into northern Syrian territory, violently pushing the Kurdish forces back with their own heavy tanks and proxy militias. They aggressively carved out physical, safe zones, effectively occupying large, strategic strips of Syrian land to act as a permanent, heavily armed buffer. Meanwhile, down in the volatile south, Another major military power was watching the shifting geopolitical map with extreme and rapidly growing alarm: Israel. Israel watched Iran's expanding military footprint and the massive influx of Hezbollah fighters into Syria as a direct, unacceptable existential threat. Completely unwilling to tolerate permanent Iranian military bases sitting right on its doorstep, Israel began fiercely conducting a quiet, deadly war within the war. Over the years, they launched hundreds of shadow airstrikes, systematically destroying Iranian weapons depots and supply convoys deeply hidden inside Syrian territory. By this point, trying to view Syria as a single, functioning sovereign nation was completely impossible. The pieces simply didn't fit together anymore. It was no longer a country, it was a massively fragmented, heavily armed geopolitical puzzle, permanently divided into four main chunks. The regime firmly controlled the highly populated western and central regions. Meanwhile, the US-backed Kurdish forces held the incredibly oil-rich northeast. Turkish-backed rebel groups tightly controlled the northwest edge, and the radical extremist group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham held the isolated, desperate Idlib province. Idlib quickly turned into a massive, heartbreaking stronghold, effectively trapping millions of internally displaced civilians with absolutely nowhere left to run. The Syrian Civil War wasn't actually ending. It wasn't being resolved in any meaningful way. It was just freezing tightly in place, locking everyone into a devastating permanent stalemate. Today, more than a full decade after those teenagers sprayed graffiti in Daraa, the Syrian Civil War remains a deeply frozen, unresolved tragedy. The raw statistics are absolutely mind-numbing to comprehend. Over 500,000 people have tragically lost their lives to the endless violence. More than 12 million people, which is over half of the entire pre-war population, were violently forced to flee their homes and abandon their lives. This staggering human exodus created a global refugee crisis that fundamentally reshaped European politics, fueled extremism, and caused widespread international anxiety. Inside the country, entire ancient cities, centuries of priceless human history, and the national economy have been effectively vaporized into dust. Looking back, the persistent myth of the quick war is exposed as a deadly, incredibly seductive illusion that blinded everyone involved. Syria proves that when a domestic conflict intersects with the strategic interests of global superpowers, the result is an endless, agonizing meat grinder. Foreign interventions, initially meant to secure quick tactical victories or easy strategic leverage, utterly failed to achieve their original goals. Instead, these outside interventions only ensured one tragic thing: they guaranteed that the war became completely unwinnable for absolutely anyone involved. Eventually, the powerful proxy sponsors simply lost interest. They cut their funding, packed up, or shifted their attention to shiny new conflicts around the globe. They callously walked away, leaving the Syrian people permanently trapped, entirely alone in the smoldering, devastated ruins of their own country. History teaches us many harsh, unforgettable lessons, but looking at the Syrian tragedy, perhaps the most devastating and urgent lesson is this: it is incredibly, deceptively easy to drop a single match and start a war, but it is nearly impossible to stop one, once the whole world decides they want to play. Thank you for watching.